Hello, everyone. Welcome to Midwestern Marks. My name is Eddie Smith, here with Carlos Garrido again, doing another video interview. This time we're with our friend Alex, who's a trade unionist working right now. He's going to talk about the history of the labor movement in the U.S., some of the challenges the labor movement has faced. So Alex, you just want to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'm Alex. I've been a friend of Carlos and Eddie's for quite a while. I was in the labor club at Loris with them, and after I left Loris, I decided to work in blue collar industry, and so I started working on the railroad about 6 months ago. I'm a member of the Brotherhood of Maintenance Away Employees Division of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. I know that's a mouthful of a union, but it's my union nonetheless. And so yeah, I work on the track itself. I don't work on the trains. So we build and maintain the track that the trains run on. So we have a pretty important role within the American economy. So important that we have special regulations that govern our industry versus other industries on the federal level. And that's, I guess that's sort of my introduction. If you guys have anything else to ask.
No, that's it for the interview. No, I guess we want to start with asking. The part of our project is to emphasize something that we feel like the left has sort of abandoned, which is looking at the revolutionary agent in the struggle for socialism as the working mass, and specifically the one that works in the industrial and agricultural productive sector overall. But in order to get a truthful insight into what's going on in this sphere is not enough to just look at it from outside, as sort of Eddie and I are able to look at it because of our class position in society. So I think it'd be interesting if you can share what your experience is from as someone within the labor industry. What are some of the challenges that you see the working class facing that are preventing it from building a militant movement?
I think a lot of the challenges that present themselves to us is there really is little contact between what we know of as the left in the United States and the industrial working class, particularly in the Midwest. But in certain parts of the country, that link has been closer together. And usually the more militant and more politically active members of the industrial working class or within the labor movement have been aligned with the Democratic Party and continue to do so, and do push the Democratic Party on specific topics and specific issues on behalf of workers. It's usually not framed as like a left or right wing position. It's usually just like well, we're looking out for workers. We want to do what's best for our workers, and we want you to support legislation that does that for our workers. A huge difficulty, though, is there's sort of a rift between a lot of rank and file union members and the unions on the national or international level. I mean, we read the little article Fortress Unionism that was really influential within the labor movement in the past few years. But one of the things that really kind of sucked away most of the energy from the labor movement was Taft-Hartley sort of bureaucratizing unions. And so unions had less to spend on organizing efforts. They had less to spend on education efforts with the rank and file. And so unions weren't necessarily doing much more with their rank and file other than just existing as what many workers would see as just an insurance agency that they pay into off their paychecks. You know, if I hadn't actively reached out to any of my union representatives, my my interaction with the union on my in my workplace would strictly be, I had a letter saying that I had to sign up and that I had to start paying dues, and then once I signed up, my dues get paid directly from my paycheck once a month, and that would have been my only interaction. I wouldn't have had any other interaction had I not, you know, been active. So a lot of the guys who started around the same time I did, their only interaction with the union has been through that, has been dues deductions. And, you know, there's a whole host of reasons why that is. Coronavirus being one of those. You know, we can't have union guys on property often to talk with us, or we can't meet often to talk with us. But also the nature of our workplace, since we move quite often, our representatives oftentimes live hundreds of miles away, and so they're not always directly there when we need them. So challenge wise, I think the big challenge is there's not a whole lot of individuals voicing, there's not a whole lot of individuals on the national level within the United States that have national recognition that are voicing concerns of the industrial working class. The left may claim that they are, but it's very true that they are not. They have continuously failed to win in post-industrial heartlands. They've lost areas that have been blue-collar dominated for years. And then, so it's not, if it isn't what is currently considered the left, someone else is going to be organizing them. And within my workplace, you know, Donald Trump spoke the language, and he's kind of enthralled a lot of my coworkers. And I see that more as a failure of the left within the United States than I do, you know, a good thing done by the Trump campaign. I think you have one of the most anti-blue collar guys of all time in Donald Trump, but yet he's speaking the language of so many workers within this country. And you know, then you're going to have a lot of liberals and stuff say that all these workers are fascists and racists, deplorables, and but if you're a socialist, the workers aren't workers because of some divine right. It's because of their position within the economy. And regardless of what an individual worker's view might be on specific issues, that position in the economy is what makes them a worker, and it's what defines their role within the revolutionary process. And you can't overlook that by just saying, oh, they're deplorable. You know, they're voting against their interest. What is their interest? I think most workers kind of know what their interests are. All my coworkers would be extremely anti-company. Any of, you know, if you ask any of them, they understand the workplace. They know we're getting screwed. They know the company's making huge profits and we're getting cut. And yet a lot of them on the political end would still vote or voted for Donald Trump, didn't vote, or, you know, there was only 2 or 3 guys I worked with that voted Democrat. But yeah, the challenges I'd say are not a whole lot of interaction between the union and the rank and file. The unions and the vast majority of workers within the United States. The right wing has done a really good job with anti-union language within the past 40 years, especially. And then on top of that, there's no organized left speaking for workers or that are workers themselves.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that. I think one of the points that that's kind of our sort of Rome that all our thought roads lead to when me and Eddie have a video is the fact that the left and the working class are divorced, and that you have this this sort of event where if workers vote against what is their own interest, against their own interest, or what seems to be their own interest, as the workers that seem to be supporting Trump or that are supporting Trump, the initial reaction of the left is, oh, they're, like you said, a basket of deplorables. They're this, they're that. We won't organize in those circles. We're going to turn away and focus our energies on somewhere else. And as Eddie and I have discussed, that does a few things. First of all, you're sort of neglecting what, as a socialist, you should consider to be the central revolutionary agent in industrial society. And you're not doing anything about those beliefs that you dislike if you're just letting them run around with other people that have those same beliefs that you might dislike. So the question I wanted to ask you is, besides this, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see the left today doing to alienate workers?
I think there's all sorts of reasons, and my opinion on it is just going to be another opinion on it. But I find that many of the problems that arise is that most of what constitutes the left within the United States aren't workers, and yet they attempt, or at least they state that they are the voice of the working class. That's harmful in it's extremely alienating for most workers. I mean, most of the people I work with, their concept of the left would just be a bunch of elitist, like people who kind of look down upon them because they don't use all these fancy words and weren't educated in a university. And like that, first of all, is a huge thing. The other thing I think that's harmfully alienating is I think the left within the United States does an incredibly awful job at materially analyzing the world around them and what makes people make the decisions that they make, and what and just because of the lack of a material understanding of society and the economy, then they jump on the campaigns that to them appear as popular campaigns, but it's only their echo chamber of individuals that support those campaigns, and so they read into them as they please. I think that that's a huge mistake. I think that we need to be critical of the positions that we take on all sorts of topics, and what topics are the most important. I mean, it should be a very simple question that we ask ourselves, like, will this help us unify the working class or not? And by like, I know you guys know, but my definition of the working class is very similar to what Marx would have had as a definition of the working class, which is those who work in productive industry, those that produce, the producers within society. And then you take all sorts of different jobs and you look at production, you look at the economy itself, the sort of the pressure points within the economy, and there is going to be a hierarchy of workers here. Which workers have more power than others? That is going to exist. Sorry, anarchists and decentralists and whatnot, but there are going to be workers that have more power within the economy than others. Yes, all work is dignified. I totally agree with that. There is, though, a difference within our economy. And so we have to look at those powerful sectors of the economy. And if those workers aren't on our side, that means that they can command the economy for the will of the other. It's very simple. Like, if we don't organize them, someone else is, and for their purposes. So I think that that's a huge mistake of the left to overlook all of that. if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think when you said the left is horrible at materially analyzing the world around them, that's what I was thinking when you were talking about, you know, anytime the left is criticized, you see it on Twitter or whatever. And I've had to get off of Twitter because it's so horrible. I feel like it's making me dumber. But it's like, anytime anyone criticizes them, like, you guys aren't speaking to the working class, this, you know, cancel culture, whatever you want to call it, is harmful to what you're doing. They're like, no, we do speak for the working class. Like, they'll say something like, we support Medicare for all, and that's good for the working class. Like, it's them imposing their ideology on, you know, or they're imposing what they want to see on the world. Like I know single payer healthcare is better, so I'm gonna say that alone makes me the voice of the working class, you know. And rather than going to the working class, like you said, asking them, hey, what do you need at your workplace? How is the system failing to meet your needs? How are you getting screwed over by the company? And then going from there, you know, it's starting from your own beliefs, your own ideology, and trying to impose that on the world around you. And that's completely allowed, as you said, the Republicans and Trump to win over the productive working class in America. And then, as you said, the left writes them off as racist. And I think Carlos made a good point too. It's like, even if you think all these people are racist or whatever, have all these reactionary social views, it's like, how are you ever going to change that if you just cancel them? If you're like, all right, we're not going to talk to anybody who says anything we disagree with socially. Like, well, okay, then they're going to say, fuck you, I'm going to go hang out with the other Trump supporters. So yeah, I think it's a failure of the left for sure.
Yeah, we have a left, like you said, Eddie, that and Alex, that it's truly an idealist left. Like, its conception of a worker doesn't really exist. It's their class of like petty bourgeois, self sort of fetishizing themselves as workers, and that's the thing about the Marxist lens, is by analyzing things from a class perspective, you can see how these downfalls happen. If the left that we have is a left that is in the circles that, I mean, shit, I'm in those circles, like these petty bourgeois academic circles, right? If that's what the left, most of the left consists of, and lump in elements that are sort of excluded from being exploited in the system, that have a lot of times even tougher conditions than the working class, but they're not the working class themselves. If this is the sort of point of view that you're taking of the world, there's no way you're going to be able to place yourself in the shoes of that sector of society that you need to be basing as your foundation if you're striving towards socialism. So I think that's not to say that you can't be like outside of the working class and be an ally. Like, that's all we're trying to do here, but you have to realize it. You have to go somewhere. And that somewhere is in the engagement with working class folks, and keeping up with what's happening in working class circles. And most of what we get in left Twitter and left news, maybe 1/10 of it has something to do with labor. Most of it is other things that they might be very good, but it bears no relationship to labor. And it really seems to be mostly the U.S. left that takes this approach. I know in Latin America, these sort of progressive movements and this academic left has been able to work within the circles of militant workers better. In Britain, it seems like they're doing also a better job of emphasizing the sort of worker epistemic in their leftist analysis. But yeah, there's something uniquely bad about the American left. So in connection to something you mentioned in one of the first points that you were talking about, and that was the Taft-Hartley Act. What role has that act played historically in the sort of demise of the worker movement and unionization? So if you can go through a short history of it for those that don't know what the Taft-Hartley Act is, and then get into some of the effects that it's had in our worker movement.
Yeah, so Taft-Hartley is a big piece of shit, as we know. Like it's not anything that we should praise by any means, especially if we call ourselves on the left in the United States. And in my opinion, it is one of the number one things that we should focus on. If you are a leftist within the United States, this should be your number one issue. Like, if you truly want to see worker ownership of anything or worker power of any sort, like this should be your focus. But anyways, the Taft-Hartley was an act that was passed in 1947 on a overriding a presidential veto by Harry Truman to establish limits on the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, as what we call it, that was passed in the 30s, that established most of our modern labor law within the United States. It basically made it possible for unions to do trade unionism, to organize effectively without major threats from the bosses and employers, to host mass organizing, to have closed shops. That act in the 30s, the Wagner Act, was able to it bursted trade unionism by something along the lines of like 300% within just a few years within the United States. And after we had already had quite a militant trade union movement within the early part of the 20th century, this ballooned it. So the 1930s was kind of like a golden age for trade unionists within the United States. And that's when we have the New Deal era start to arise. You have public works for unemployed, so on. And a lot of this was then bolstered or even further supported by the labor movement, the newly, muscleized labor movement, or newly strengthened. And so in the 1940s, during the war effort, you basically have full employment. And it wasn't until the late 40s men started returning that they had a very militant labor movement at already existing within the United States. And so this was utilized. The year of the most strikes within the United States was 1945. Over 1 million workers at one time were on strike within the United States. And people talk about, very specific labor battles here and there within the United States all the time. We have these like glory shots of history that leftists love to like zoom in on, but like they never talk about 1945, and they never talk about like the dynamic of having that many workers on strike within the United States at one time. Like, that's why don't we discuss these periods of American history where, yeah, there might not be a big socialist at the helm of these strikes, but who cares? This is worker militancy happening. We should be following workers, not just big name socialists. So this happens, and this scares powerful interests within the United States. That those powerful interests start drafting the Taft-Hartley Act, which I believe was originally Hartley's plan, but then Taft kind of joined along, and good cop, bad cop type deal. But what this did was it basically made trade unionism as it was prior to the Wagner, or not prior to the Wagner Act, but it basically made trade unionism in the way that it was allowed to flourish with the Wagner Act illegal in that way. So this is when you have the establishment of right to work laws, in which still 20 some states within the US still have right to work laws, Iowa included. This is what made it illegal for like foremen and managers to be dues-paying members of the unions, and be on union side rather than the company side. The anti-communist affidavit was famously in that. The employer right to free speech. So employers then have the ability to go into the workplace and basically educate their workers on anti-union propaganda. So, I mean, we're famous now with Amazon and Walmart and companies like them that have, well-watched anti-union campaigns you can find on YouTube. Or just a couple years back in 2017 at the Nissan plant in Mississippi, famously, they were playing like Road to Destruction on the loudspeakers like 24 hours a day, to try and just demoralize the workers on the factory floor. No secondary boycotts. So if there was a sort of if there was one strike going on, you couldn't basically sympathy strike. Your grievances have to be just with your employer only, for the most part. And then what else? There's a whole host of things within Taft-Hartley that make it harder for trade unionists within the United States to operate. And because it became national legislation, labor unions had to spend a lot more money on hiring lawyers and educating their own individuals within offices, to handle sort of the legalistic language that was going to occur because of this. No longer was your mediation going to be just you and your buddies and versus your boss. Like, you weren't going to take direct wildcat action like you would in the days prior to it. There's stories in the 1930s within Iowa of meatpacking plants firing a single worker and all the guys just walking home for the day, and they'd come back tomorrow if the worker was reinstated, but just walking off right there. Your grievance was with the employer, and then you handled it at that moment. You didn't have to go through the steps of the National Labor Relations Board to have a strike and to have a proper strike vote. You just did it. It made all of that basically illegal in that sense. It made everything legalistic, and many people hate trade unions today because that's how they view them. They view trade unions as very, legalistic. It's guys in suits, handling a lot of money that us members never get to see. But there's a reason for that, and the reason isn't because the unions wanted that to be the case. The reason is because people in power, people in positions of power, made it so that unions had to be that way to be able to operate within the United States. So that's my brief overview of Taft-Hartley, I guess. Hopefully you guys can make some sense of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. It kind of feels like it even defeats the purpose of any sort of protest. If you're told how you can protest, when you can protest, you have to go through all these sort of legalistic mumbo jumbo to do anything. One of the things you mentioned, I think it was called the Secondary Host Act.
The Secondary Host Act?
Mm-hmm.
I meant the secondary protests, like
secondary protests. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that seems to completely strike at the heart of what any working class movement needs, which is solidarity and unity. Mm-hmm. If you can't stand in solidarity with a strike going on in another workplace, you're done. You can't. You're removing the legs out of the body of the working class. So, yeah, I don't know if you had anything to say concerning that, Eddie, but I didn't know about that. But yeah.
I don't know. I just jumped to that's typical example of the state being used as an apparatus to crush to crush labor. But then, so what's your solution then to solve that problem? Do you just think we need to fight the political battle and start getting politicians in who are pushing to repeal Taft-Hartley and strengthen the unions, or where do we start, I guess?
I mean, I think it's a pretty simple answer, like to what we do. My life is that answer in many cases. I mean, I don't mean to be like tooting my horn or anything, but I believe that I'm doing what I need to do in order to get those things solved and to change those things. And that is, if we want to have a political movement that is a voice, an independent voice for the working class, the political movement is only an echo of the economic movement, and political organization only flows from the economic organization. So everybody talks politics all the time, and yes, it's important, but without any sort of economic organization, it's useless. And I know that a lot of people that follow politics online are going to be not in shock, but like, people follow politics online like it's a sport. People follow certain individuals online and cheer for them like a team. And they do it just because they like it. They don't do it because they have any conviction. There's a difference between saying that you're a socialist or a Marxist or whatever, and then actually like devoting your time to the conviction of it, which is like, if you truly believe that in socialism, like, you cannot avoid the working class, the industrial working class, those within the economy that serve that purpose or that play that role in the economy. So if you want to, the repeal of Taft-Hartley is an essential thing for the labor movement moving forward. It might not be the first thing that the labor movement does, but it's definitely has to be a goal. And I think it is a goal. The labor hasn't been able to repeal a comma of it since it was instated. And labor was quite powerful within the 70s and the 90s, but still hasn't been able to repeal any of it. And so, like, I know that the Biden campaign has said that they support the PRO Act, which would effectively repeal some parts of Taft-Hartley, right to work especially, which would be a massive boost for industrial labor within the United States. But, you know, most people on the left are still poo-pooing Biden all the time. And okay, I understand, you know, I probably wouldn't piss on him if he was on fire. But if he's going to pass the PRO Act, I'm going to be pretty happy. I mean, that's a huge win for workers. Like, that's probably the biggest win for workers in a long time within the United States. And so if that happens, that's great. But I wouldn't bank on it at this point, because I think the economic organization of the workers is very, very fragile currently. Like I said, that the difference between most rank and file members and their unions that represent them is quite vast. I mean, I think most of the union population is just voting like the rest of the population, depending on where they live, is what's basically going to decide who they vote for. There's very loose unity amongst the rank and file, even if there is unity amongst the national of specific unions. My union's a perfect example, and you know, my workplace, everybody's basically a Trump supporter or a non-voter, but our national union, you know, in 2014 passed a resolution regarding saying that we support a single-payer healthcare system. So our national union has said that, but our rank and file would you know, say that that's an awful idea. So there's a weakness there within the labor movement, and if we want to strengthen that, like, we got to have people in the labor movement that are going to push for those things. and it's going to be a long process. You know, we want to win power. It's not about being the most perfect, clean, and having the most principled um, of socialist or whatever views you want to have. It's about power, and so it's a chess match. Um, any exposure might make part of you vulnerable, and so always view it in that way. Always view it as a power move. Always view it as, what can I do in this moment to advance things on the further down the line.
For sure.
That reminded me of 2 points. First, the structure that you lay out of economic organization preceding political involvement. That's straight out of perhaps one of the greatest industrial organizers in our history, Big Bill Haywood. He says it's first of all a shop fight. It is a fight that starts where exploitation happens, and only then can it take form in the political arena. One of the other things that you said earlier, which I think I forgot to comment on, but that you just reminded me of, is when you were talking about 45 and the strikes, and how the left does not look at those strikes enough. And despite the fact that it was that massive, where 1 million people were on strike, it's not focused on it because it wasn't necessarily guided by big socialist or leftist figures. And that's one of the things that I think the left and those who call themselves socialists and communists need to understand, that the interest of the advancement, the advancement of the interest of the working class is the advancement of the interest of socialism. So if you see a movement that is advancing the interest of the working class, even if it's not led by socialists, that is an advancement of the socialist movement. That is something you must support as a socialist. Being principled is not saying, if it's not led by socialists, if it's not led by the party, then I won't join, right? If it doesn't have the perfect ideas, I won't join. Being principled is realizing and being pragmatic about what are the best steps to take right now to advance the cause of socialism, which is indivisible with the cause of the advancement of labor and the power of labor. One of the last things I wanted to ask is one of the bigger focuses that Eddie and I have for our project is the anti-imperialist approach, which again, two things that we see completely lacking in the left today is their appeal to workers and their analysis of geopolitical situations. And I guess I want to see what these two different circles, which the left is doing a really bad job in, what their relation are to each other. So what would you say is the relationship between the worker movement in the US and the international movement for socialism? Is there any relationship there?
I think it's an extremely difficult question. I mean, you're going to have people that say like, oh, well, it's one and the same and the interests are the same. But then again, there's the ideal aspect of it, and then there's the tactical aspect of it. Now, I'm not going to get if any of my coworkers to read anything regarding what's going on in Venezuela or what's going on in China or what's going on with the general strike in India currently. I'm not. I don't think it's. I think that the way forward for socialism within the United States is going to be within the American working class. Like, we have to understand that, like, again, politics for most people that follow politics in the United States is like it's like a sport. It's like a hobby for them. They read the things that align with, that are kind of within the realm of their political ideology. Socialists are just as guilty as anyone else. And so they have this sort of canon of things that they read. and of places where they read them from. And then like that's just like what constitutes you being within that sphere of politics. So the vast majority of people within the United States are not going to really care about the specifics of what's going on halfway across the globe or even next door to us. I think it's going to be a very difficult thing to connect the two. I don't think it's impossible or that it's not a noble task, but I think that if we want to win workers to like our side, I mean, basically, I trying to say things like I don't think that we should be like isolationist in that we don't interact with international movements or whatnot. You know, Richard Trumka, head of the AFL-CIO, met with Lula while he was in prison still. Like that's a huge thing. I'm not saying that can't happen. Just saying that like the level of education that we have for workers where we currently are to where they might need to be, to have those sort of connections be very fruitful. Like you're not going to see any of my coworkers being like, did you see like Trumka met with Lula while he was in prison? Like that's great for international solidarity. Like that makes our labor movement so strong. Like, no, because first of all, no one that I work with knows who Trumka is. No one that I work with knows who Lula is. And they don't give a shit to learn about either. But do my coworkers care about their paycheck and how the company treats us? Like, of course. So I think it's just like yeah, of course we should care about specific issues, but we shouldn't expect all these people to like and learn about all of the things that we like and learn about. And I think that that's a huge mistake. We talked about mistakes of the left earlier, but I think that that's a huge mistake of the left, is that not only does the left try and take ideas and then like give them to the workers or like, you know, push them on workers, but they also try to do that with like all of these other campaigns and issues. And like we lack very basic worker organizations. Like our unions are very hollowed out. Like how do we expect workers within the United States to have a very robust view of anti-imperialism without even a very basic like level in their own workplace, like of worker organization? Like we have to start very local and then move out from there. I think that's, to answer the question, I think that's the very basic thing I could say is like, we have to start very local. Like people wouldn't believe how backwards or how weak our labor movement is. I mean, to see how weak it is, you have the AFL-CIO like supporting the most recent trade or international trade legislation that Trump passed, because they don't have another option. Like they're not strong enough to say, oh, we're going to take 14 million workers on strike because you won't pass legislation that we want. Like, no, none of the workers are going to follow. So we lack such basic worker organization within the United States. And then the left, like I see the left talk about all sorts of other issues and topics. And, you know, like Eddie, you mentioned Twitter earlier. And like, if I go on Twitter, I just get so upset because I see so many of my like friends that I met within the left wing movement, and like they're just talking absolute nonsense most of the time. Like if I'm off Twitter for a day, I don't know what they're talking about. Like it's all this echo chamber of people and no real work being done. It's unfortunate, really.
Yeah, it's just people reacting to what's in the news cycle. I remember before the election, we knew there was going to be this red mirage scenario, you know, where the mail-in votes were going to come in later and they were going to be Democratic. And still, if you went on Twitter during election day, it was the, you know, Rose, whatever it is, the DSA Twitter is freaking out. Oh, the Democrats blew it again. Trump won. They just lost their minds because Trump went up in the polls, you know, because they're just hyper focused on the news cycle and just reacting to whatever is in mainstream media at the current time. I did want to add one thing though, because we were talking about the connection of anti-imperialism to workers. I think the connection that can be made right now that I've seen in my own experience is from, we're also sending people from the US, you know, to die in these, you know, ridiculous wars, and connecting that with workers, I think is a way to get them invested and get them organized. That's been my experience with basically 100% of the people I've known who have gone into the military. So I just wanted to add that there, because I think that's, you know, you were talking about we can't really get workers to care about China or Venezuela, you know, which makes sense. But if a worker is going to be sent to Iraq, or his son is going to be sent to Iraq, then we can get them to care. You know, that's also part of the simple messaging of, you know, like peace, land, and bread, or whatever. You know, you got to make it simple for people, rather than expecting them to have the most nuanced views on all these social issues, or on the issues of anti-imperialism. You know, you got to realize that, as you say a lot, you know, most people's only interaction with politics is once every 4 years during the election. So yeah, I don't know, I just wanted to add that.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely a hard situation, because socialism is, and the movement towards socialism is a purely humanistic thing. It has principled foundations, right? And it's hard because there's a dialectic between having to work with what you have and having these ideals as well. And sometimes there's clashes, like you were mentioning. We have a working class that if it's not in their direct interest, they're not going to give a damn, right? And we can.
I think, and yeah, like people might think that that's a huge like downfall of the American working class, but it also can be a huge strength. I mean, like there are things that are specific to the American working class, like blue collar industrial workers. Like there's a specific mentality that exists there, like basically like fuck you. Like we know who we are, and like you look down upon us, but yet like what we do, we take pride in, and there's very much a pride within the immediacy of what surrounds workers, and like I say, like I'm very proud of like what I do every day, and like I actually, you know, enjoy the work itself. Like it's good work. Like yeah, it's dangerous in some ways, and but it's like yeah, it's something to be proud of. And like I get to wake up every day, and like in 30 years, you know, if I'm taking my kids driving, and like I can point at the section of rail and say like I, you know, helped build that with my coworkers, like that's cool. And you know how many like millions of dollars passed over that in tonnage, like in those 30 years, you know, because like it's just something that's really neat. And workers are proud of what they do. Like, but those are like strengths of the American working class.
Yeah, I mean, I would see it as both a strength and a weakness in some sense. I feel like there needs to be this sort of at least basic level of care for other people. But even if you don't have it and you're having to work with this working class that's proud, like you said, of what it is, and has this fuck you attitude, and it has been pushed into this sort of attitude. That's another thing, that at one point it wasn't like that. It's been all of these attacks that has sort of, it's played a massive influence in it being like that. But that's the thing about socialism, that even if you have someone who has a purely individualistic approach in the working class, you can still appeal to them, and in that appeal manifest sort of a collective interest, right? And show them how their individual interest is also tied to the collective. So I think that people could become scared of the fact that, like you said, they hear, well, workers don't give a damn about what's going on here, there, or around the world. And it's like, but they give a damn about what's going on in their situation, right? And from their situation, you can build on onto a future where they can actually give a damn about what's going on with the empire, right? But it all stems from what is the condition of the labor movement now. And in a weak labor movement, you have to think about yourself before others. If a plane's crashing, the first thing they tell you is, even before you take care of your kids, you have to put your own mask on. And that's the situation of the labor movement. It's so weak where it needs to be that us mentality, at least while it grows until, and at some point then it could sort of stem out and start expressing solidarity with the rest of the world. But if it can express solidarity with its own working movement in another state, how can we expect it to do so with movements around the world? So
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, I think so. With what I've been talking about this weak labor movement for most of the conversation, and I think like it's just worth giving more sort of examples of how it is weak. And like if we look at the sectors and like the things that people are currently unionizing, and there are great unionizing efforts going on across the country that we should point out and that we should note. However, a lot of what's getting news are like newsrooms and like coffee shops and stuff that are organizing, which great for those workers. Like, don't get me wrong, but if a bunch of journalists go on strike, like my day is probably going to be made better than worse. And that's not a good thing. Like, if you go on strike, you want to cripple, the economy. Like, you don't just want to cripple the company, because, I mean, most companies are involved with other companies in certain ways, and especially major companies. But like, if auto workers or railroad workers, which can't technically strike, but if there is any sort of strike within very key heavy industrial industries, like the ripples of that haven't even been, you can't even calculate like just how many industries and just how many areas would be affected by any sort of industrial action. And so just the strength of that, and like the fact that most people on the left today, are praising these organizing efforts at newsrooms and whatnot. But okay, that is great. Like, that's really good for those workers that they now have a collective say within their workplace. But like, if you call yourself a socialist or a leftist today, like, you should devote your time to helping to organize key industries within the economy, or all like strengthening already existing worker organizations within those areas. Because if you don't do it, who else is going to do it? Like, for example, my dad works in a chemical plant, and like their union is almost entirely powerless currently because of nobody that's around our generation age going in and wanting to work strongly within the union, like or take up the reins from the older guys within the union. Like, most got in because they got a huge pay raise, or most got in, they got hired right before a new contract, And in the new contract, the company waved a huge pay raise in front of them. And so all the new guys voted yes. Now, that's a common tactic of companies. They'll do a massive hiring of young guys right before a major contract negotiation, give a higher wage, but take away a lot of benefits that had previously been won to get those passed. And that happens, and that weakens the union. Young guys don't want to show up to meetings. So, like, if I had any advice, it's okay, then we have to have people that show up and go to those meetings and vote for those things and vote for proper worker policies, and then also want to work within the organizations. Like, that's key.
For sure. Do you have any more questions, Carlos, or we can wrap it up here? We've been going for about an hour.
No, I think it's been a very productive chat interview. We have a lot of young people and working class people that watch our videos and follow us, and probably more specifically Eddie. And I think this is going to be a very important talk for them to listen to, analyze, and marinate on some of the things that we've been talking about, because I think that in this talk lies the pith of what the struggle for socialism has to look like, if it's going to be a serious struggle, and not one that with every step forward. I didn't say Siri, come on phone. that's the NSA. But if it wants to be a struggle that doesn't take two steps back every time it takes one step forward, it's going to have to listen to some of the things that we've talked about here. So as far as us that are not in the industrial sector and that are not able to organize from inside, we will do our best to continue these chats on bringing the perspective from the inside, and urging people that if they share our ideas and the struggle for socialism, to join a trade union, to join the fight in industrial labor, and to recognize that unlike what the general sort of capitalistic mentality tells you about the working life, that the working life is something that's quite dignified and fruitful. Like you said, it's one of the few professions where you can look and say, well, I helped made that, and that's extremely influential in people's everyday life. So yeah, it's been an honor to talk with you. I want to thank you, and thank you, Eddie, as well.
Well, thank you guys for having me on.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for having me on. It's always a pleasure talking with some old friends.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome.
See you, folks.